Good evening. Good evening. For anybody that has joining us after it says recording in progress so everyone can hear, this webinar is being recorded. You will have access to this webinar for your viewing pleasure after the fact as well. You should get an on-demand link, so which is nice. All
I
right.
wish I could see the people in the thing. Is that possible?
What I can start doing is letting people in. The people are coming in.
I like to see people's
Almost here.
faces.
Out. See, I don't. If we do the meeting, I lose all the data. So
Yeah.
it's just a meeting link. So it doesn't have the same. I don't have the same sharing possibilities. I can't do on demand. I can't do all that stuff. So there is some limitations when it comes to that. Um, I was hoping that that would not be the case, but it is. Here, what I will do is when I allow them to talk, it will show up, we'll throw up a little.
Alba's in the house.
Alba's here. We got the superhuman who just joined us. Somebody must have had a problem with their login. What's going on, Mr. Sanchez? Hope you're having an amazing Tuesday.
What's up, guys?
Yeah,
Hey, hey.
just living the dream.
I'm excited about today. I hadn't really looked a whole lot into Thymulin and Epitalon other than knowing it was really great for anti-aging. And
Hmm.
as I started, doing some more research into some of Khavinson's studies, I really started to get excited about this, especially being an aging fellow myself, being 50 years old, and, staying younger and more vital for longer in my life is starting to become more and more important as I age. I'm kind of getting really excited about these two peptides.
And I was just Joy Kong, right? Dr. Joy Kong.
Uh-huh, yeah.
She she is.
Yeah, we sell her stem cells.
Well, and her
She
stem
buys me
cells,
to sell stem cells.
that's where she started off as. She's quad board certified. She's an anti-aging specialist. She's amazing. Um, but recently she has absolutely got on board about using peptides.
I know it's
And
funny, like 6 months ago, she was not all about it at all.
she actually put out today, I reposted it on LinkedIn. She just put out today her stacks, everything that she uses, and then the cycles that she uses them on. And interestingly enough, you were talking about the Epitalon. She actually mentioned Epitalon exactly for the reasons that you're talking about, the rejuvenation effect and for the longevity.
I'll tell
But
you, it really helps your sleep as well. It really helps your circadian rhythm and sleep patterns.
well,
Makes you pretty sleepy as well. If you take it during the day, you're going to be screwed.
it's one of those things that we well, and also that she was talking about cycling, and it's one of the things that we talk about as well is, they're great peptides and they can do wonderful things to you, but they're not where you are feeding this to to your goat or to your kangaroo just
Day in, day out. Yeah.
perpetually. Yeah, just perpetually. There
Yeah,
is.
generally Epitalon is seen as like a 1 to 3 times a year cycling for
Hmm.
20 days. It's a 20-day cycle, like 3 times a year maximum.
That's exactly what she was saying, that she basically does it once a quarter,
Hmm.
you
Four
know.
times a year. I guess you could do 4 times a year.
Yeah, and maybe that's just information that she's getting, but that's what she was giving of everything. And BP 157, TB 500, those were all her regime, you
Do
know.
you, all the usual suspects.
Absolutely. Now, the one that she didn't mention though that we've talked about too in some respects is the 5 amino,
The five
which
amino, yeah.
yeah,
I don't think she really talks about, she doesn't really talk so much about, does she have Motzi on her list?
Motzi was on there.
Okay.
Motzi, but I don't
She,
believe she
she
talked
should,
about
she'll
SF31.
probably, she's a little behind in the peptide game, I think. like I said, 6 months ago, she was like, "No, I don't use peptides. Like, I'm not into peptides." Like, she was kind of anti, not
Hmm.
anti, but she just wasn't really so into it.
On the fence.
Um, and I think she was kind of on the fence with it. So I think she's a little late to the game with peptides, and so
Hmm.
I don't think she has probably really discovered retatrutide yet.
Oh, she has. That was actually the one she was
Oh,
asking questions
that was
about.
on her list. Oh, okay,
Yeah, yeah, the
she's
Reddit
coming
True Tide.
around. She's
Yeah.
making quick progress. Just like 2 or 3 short weeks ago, I was looking at her stuff and she was still kind of like hanging pretty far out there, like not so into it. So she's getting on board. She's getting
She's
on the
definitely getting on
peptide
board.
train.
She's definitely getting on board. And one of the fun things that I found is that she was asking the question, about the GLPs, and then the triple, the Retta, and asked the simple question, which one to the viewing audience would you prefer?
I
And
hope everybody raised their hand for Retta. The other two are trash.
yeah, well, they're just limited, they don't, unless you're strategic and targeted about it, you can do some hard, especially as we get older. For you and I, losing muscle is not a good thing,
And bone density loss. Bone density loss is hard to get back.
especially as we age.
Yeah.
So when you combine those two things to me, which become as we get older, no matter what we do, it's going to be a little more difficult to, put on those extra muscular pounds as that we would want to. So when I looked at those, I stayed away from those personally just because like I can't afford to start getting brittle bones and losing my muscle. Yeah, I'll be leaner, but I'll be weaker. Does that really, am I healthier even though I'm leaner?
Yeah.
That's really
You'll
the
be the
kind of the question.
Kelly Osbourne.
Oh my
You seen
gosh,
that fool? Holy
she looks
shit, she looks like
horrible.
a skeleton. It's like, what the?
Well,
It's
what about Megan
crazy.
Trainor?
I don't even know who that is.
Megan Trainor is this young singer. She's a cute gal for sure. But she was a little on the thicker side. And she actually owned it really well. I mean, she was like, she had a song. Remember the song All About That Bass?
I don't remember that.
Okay. Well,
I don't know. I don't know like popular music
it's
very
okay. It's
well.
okay. Not a big deal. Well, we were talking about Terrence and Darby just a little bit ago, so I figured, yeah.
Yeah.
But
Okay. So
so
let's make sure the webinar chat is working. Can somebody throw something in the chat to make sure
hold
we're
on, it's not
working?
working. I haven't enabled it for well, actually everybody should be able to. I did something pre this time that was supposed to. Yep, everybody should be able to chat. Please toss something in the yep.
All right. Great. We hear you. We hear
Beautiful.
you. All right. Housekeeping. Before we begin, please understand that everything discussed today is strictly for research and educational purposes only.
Hmm.
Any compounds, protocols, or dosing information mentioned are intended for research context only and are not medical advice. These substances are not intended to diagnose, treat, cure, or prevent any disease. Nothing shared in this discussion should be interpreted as a recommendation for personal use. Always consult a qualified healthcare professional before making any health-related decisions for you or your kangaroo.
Yes. And thank you for that public service announcement.
All right, now that we got the FDA off our back, let's talk peptides.
Let's do it.
So this week we're talking about Thymulin and Epitalon, and I'm going to actually share my screen here. How do I share my screen?
The little green arrow at the bottom. Go ahead and click on that. Then what I would recommend is that you have your presentation already brought up. Then choose that window and it will go to the full screen. Choose the slideshow and that will take it to the full screen.
All right, are we full screen?
Mhm. Looks like it. Hold on. You caught me doing some behind the scenes stuff. Yes, sir. That's full screen.
Okay, cool. All right. Thymulin and Epitalon are peptide bioregulators that are studied in aging and longevity research. So much of what we're going to discuss today comes from Khavinson's research, Vladimir Khavinson, who is kind of known as the father of peptides. We've talked about him a couple of times before on the episodes. He discovered many of the peptides. Much of the peptide research that we know today came directly from him and his team. He is a Russian scientist that started studying these things back in the late 60s, early 70s, up through until the 90s, where he published. I mean, you'll see he published, I think, over like 600 papers or something. I have it in the presentation here that we'll see in a little bit. But this guy was pretty rad and pretty instrumental in exactly where we find ourselves today in the peptide world. So, especially when it comes to gerontology research or the research of old people and aging, right? So let's get into it. Why is that not working? Just a second. Okay, there we go. All right. So, why do we study peptides in aging? Aging involves a systematic decline of the immune system, endocrine signaling, and cellular repair mechanisms. Glandular involution, or shrinkage, if you will, it occurred specifically in the thymus and pineal glands. So these two peptides that we're going to be discussing in the presentation today are all about aging. Literally everything regarding the way our bodies deal with signaling from other peptides even goes back to specifically the thymus and the pineal gland. So if those things are working correctly, all other peptides that you're taking are going to have a cascading effect that is larger. I also want to say, as we're going through this and as we finish, if people have other unrelated questions, things about past episodes or just new questions, feel free. Again, this is a presentation about these two, but if you have other questions, this is a forum. Please throw them in the chat. Um, Homeboy Tony will alert me that there's something in the chat and interrupt, and we'll talk about something else. So just let us know. So anyway, the regulatory deficit. So with the decline of the regulatory peptides, it really directly influences the onset of age-related disease. So aging is associated with reduced synthesis of regulatory peptides and decreased cellular sensitivity to them. So, like I said, if these two glands are working correctly and they're signaling correctly, all other signaling coming from any other peptides is going to be more sensitive across the board. So that's why these two are super influential and important. So there's sort of like a diagram on the right hand side you can see here that shows the pathology risk goes up as the synthesis of bioregulators in the body goes down, and the peptide synthesis level naturally in the body starts to decrease as pathology risk goes up. So Khavinson's research is basically, by and large, for I think 10 or 12 years, he did like massive studies on these two particular peptides, like very long ongoing studies. So this concept of epigenetic regulation, right? So peptides are interacting with specific DNA sites to restore youthful gene expression patterns. Now, I kind of want to, like, we talk about these things as what some peptides is working transcriptionally. I keep saying that all the time. Um, when we talk about GHKCU, how it's not just signaling, but it's actually working transcriptionally. I want to do a quick little sidebar here because I say that all the time. And I had 3 people last week be like, dude, what the hell does transcriptional mean? What does working transcriptionally even mean? So I actually put together a quick little document. Can you see that? Can you guys see that, or is it not up?
It is up.
It is up. Okay. So I just want to talk really quickly for 5 minutes about what DNA transcription actually means. So DNA contains genes, which are the instructions for making proteins. Everything in the body boils down to proteins, right? So what a cell needs is protein. It first copies that gene into an mRNA, a messenger RNA, and that copying process is called DNA transcription. So the reason that transcriptional processes are important is when those genes are getting copied sometimes, those copies can be like a photocopy machine. Those old photocopy machines where like a copy of a copy of a copy, and that thing looks like shit and it's all scratchy and blown out and you can't see the details, et cetera, et cetera. Back in the 80s and 90s with the copy machines, you can think of it that way. So mRNA travels to ribosomes and ribosomes translate it into a protein. So DNA to RNA, mRNA to a protein. So it's the first transcription is the first step in making proteins. And why this matters for peptides. So proteins are controlling everything in the body, enzymes, hormones, immune molecules, structural proteins like collagen, which is super important when we're talking about GHK-Cu copper, peptide, which we talk about in length, it seems like every week. It's very popular. Repair proteins and antioxidants. So if a peptide changes transcriptions, it means it can change what proteins the cell produces. So if your cell is producing more proteins that influence inflammation, tissue repair, aging, immune activity, things like this, rather than working on like, trash proteins that are causing inflammation or reactive oxygen species or all of these other things, peptides can influence transcription through cell signaling is the most common way, right? So peptide binds to a receptor, it triggers signaling, transcription factors activate in the genes. So the example of the pathway could be peptide to receptor, signaling cascade, transcriptional factors happen, and gene activation turns on. So what genes are we activating? What proteins are we building? With epigenetic regulation, some peptides interact with histones, which we'll see very quickly here with the thymulin, chromatin, and DNA regulatory regions. They can make these genes more or less accessible. So having more access to all of these things is going to help with aging or fighting aging, right? So it's like you can think about it like I put in the notes here, as like loosening or tightening the DNA packaging. So are we letting this get loose with frayed ends, or are we tying this up in a neat little package? So some peptides, Khavinson's work suggested that shorter peptides can bind to specific DNA sequences, normalizing gene expression and restoring youthful activity. So, for example, thymulin, which is the first thing we're going to talk about in this presentation, primarily affects immune gene transcription, which involves T cell maturation, cytokine signaling, and immune regulation. So it brings a stronger immune response and a better immune balance. So when we say a stronger immune response, we don't mean an overactive immune response. We mean a balanced but strengthened immune response. When we're talking about GHK-Cu, which we do a lot, the gene regulation that's happening there, it's turning on genes that are involved with tissue repair, collagen production, especially collagen production, which leads to tissue repair, antioxidant defense, and stem cell activation. All very important things for rebuilding and anti-aging. And it turns off genes involved with inflammation, oxidative damage, and tissue breakdown. So that's why GHK-Cu is not just studied for skin regeneration, but also for wound healing, the sort of like basis building block for muscle building and wound healing and anti-aging alike. And then another example would be Epitalon. So it affects transcriptionally by increasing telomerase activation. So telomerase enzyme production goes up, circadian rhythm genes, and antioxidant pathways. So we've talked about telomerase and telomeres before. Telomeres are these little things on the ends of our genes that as we age, they shorten. They get shorter and shorter and shorter. And it's literally seen across the board. It happens to every single person. As you age, your telomeres shorten. So also seen, as we'll talk about in the presentation, as we do things to lengthen our telomeres again, we actually create an anti-aging process. Like you can actually de-age your body at a cellular level. So it's not just sort of, how do we say it? It's not just sort of like slowing the clock, but in a way, it can be somewhat like actually turning the clock back in many ways on the aging process. So the simple analogy here is you can think of DNA as a massive cookbook. Every gene is a recipe. Transcription is copying that recipe so that it can be cooked. And peptides act like editors deciding which recipes get copied. So what are we having for dinner? Are we going to have donuts and chips and nachos and popcorn? Or are we going to have vegetables and protein and, good things for the body? So some recipes are turned on and some of them are turned off, right? So on means more proteins are produced, off means less proteins are produced. And both can be good depending on which proteins you're turning on and off, because some of the proteins are bad proteins. Some of the proteins are causing aging more, right? And when we say proteins, we're talking about literally almost everything in the body. So all peptides are is short chains of amino acids bound together in particular arrangements. And those are the building blocks of proteins, right? So all of those aminos are the building blocks of all proteins, which build everything in the body, starts out of proteins. So why is this important for anti-aging research? So bad gene expression patterns like chronic inflammation, reduced repair proteins, mitochondrial dysfunction, also proteins, and poor immune regulation can be restored if we restore those gene expression patterns. So this is where longevity medicine, regenerative medicine, and immunotherapies come into play. So you can think about this like when peptides like Thymulin or GHK-Cu are affecting DNA transcription, they're influencing what genes the cell uses to make proteins. So they're directly influencing what proteins are made, thereby changing how the cell behaves. So I hope that gives everybody a nice little tidbit on what transcription means, since I say that word all the time, and I had lots of people ask me this week, what the hell does that actually mean? Okay, so back to Khavinson's peptide bioregulator theory. So the concept is that he had this concept that the shorter chain peptides, typically two to seven amino acids in length, are allowing for easier cell penetration. And tissue, like these are all tissue specific, so they act specifically on the tissues from which they were isolated. So every week we've talked about how peptides are very specifically targeted. Like they all kind of do a little bit of a bunch of things. Like let's say MOTC is a mitochondrial peptide. SS31 is a mitochondrial peptide. They're targeting mitochondrial function, but they're doing it in different ways, right? So MOTC is targeting very specifically mitochondrial biogenesis, or the creation of new fresh mitochondria and getting rid of those old senesced mitochondria. While that's working on the mitochondria in that way, the SS31 isn't so much building an army of new mitochondria as it is really tuning up the mitochondria that you've just built with your MOTC or that you have naturally, and repairing the membrane walls, improving the electron transport chain, and improving the mitochondrial efficiency. So you could think about this bioregulator theory concept the same, where where he talks about them being tissue specific. They're very much acting on the tissues that they were isolated from. So when we talk about thymulin and epitalon, epitalon is a pineal gland peptide, and epithalon is a thymus gland peptide, right? That's where they're literally derived from and where we find them naturally in the body. So they're going to be targeting those very specific places in the body, similar to how each other peptide we talk about is very targeted. They'll have some outliers and other things that they do, and they crosstalk with each other, but they'll be very targeted. So the regulatory function, they're regulating gene expression and protein synthesis to restore balance. And that's what we were talking about before with that gene expression. What genes are being turned on? What proteins are being made? So helping restore physiological rhythms and metabolic process, which is balancing homeostasis, right? So peptides work on histone complexes and protein synthesis. And the way they're regulated happens before those. So this little diagram kind of shows you in a cell nucleus, the regulatory process, what happens, what proteins are made that then go through the histone complex and create what overall proteins on the end. This is how the peptide DNA interaction model works. So Vladimir Khavinson, he was the president of the European region of International Association of Gerontology and Geriatrics. He was the founder of the St. Petersburg Institute of Bioregulation and Gerontology. And like I said before, he's kind of known as the father of peptides. He developed most of what we know about peptide bioregulator therapy concept that everybody's built on these days. He had over 600 plus publications and 100 plus patents that he wrote and owned in his team. Studying peptide regulation, organ specificity. So organ specific, again, like we just talked about, being very targeted, and longevity, focusing on life extension and disease prevention strategies, which is the reason that he studied so heavily the thymic and pineal peptides. He saw the axis between these two bioregulators in the role of aging, the pineal gland and the thymus gland. So thymulin, it literally is in the Thymulin family, which comes originally from the thymus gland. And its main function is immune system regulation and T cell maturation. Epitalon is from the epithalamin family, from the pineal gland, and it controls aging, circadian rhythms, and telomere lengthening, as we discussed earlier. So both of these undergo severe shrinkage with age, involution or shrinkage. And these peptides are key drivers of aging pathology. So thymulin in the immune system peptide. So it's produced by the reticuloepithelial cells of the thymus gland. It's a nonapeptide, which is 9 amino acids. And one thing to note, that bioactivity of this particular peptide involves zinc. It requires zinc. So we talk about different substances or different peptides or different things being activated more by different enzymes or having what we call a cofactor. A cofactor is something that actually builds something up and makes it work more. So when we're talking about, let's say, methylene blue, if you're just taking methylene blue, you're just on its own, excuse me, you're not really activating it like you could be. If you're taking it with high amounts of vitamin C, even just taking and putting those drops in some orange juice and shooting the orange juice, like I do every morning, you can really activate it with that cofactor or coenzyme of vitamin C. So thymulin requires zinc. It's dependent on zinc to function at its most. So if you are taking thymulin, if you're using this particular peptide, you should be also supplementing with zinc as well, because it's going to burn and use zinc. We talk about certain nootropics as burning, like, let's say, for instance, aniracetam. I work with aniracetam a lot. Aniracetam burns all the choline in your brain. It can severely deplete choline in your brain. So when you take aniracetam with any supplementation, you should be actually adding some choline or cytocholine or alpha GPC or some version of choline also, or you can get headaches with it. So there can be side effects, or things can just not work as well if they don't have these cofactors with them.
It's like the
So
building blocks, right? If
the
you don't
what?
have, like, it's the building blocks. If you don't have those readily available,
Yeah, it's like trying to drive your car without oil in it. Like you put gas in it to drive, but then the engine's going to seize up without oil. It's not going to work so smoothly or correctly, right?
yeah,
So the biological roles of thymulin are T cell maturation and differentiation. immune system regulation, anti-inflammatory signaling, and the restoration of thymic function. So we talk about thymic function versus age, right? Thymic function goes down as we age, as the thymus shrinks dramatically after puberty. Literally after puberty, our thymus starts shrinking, right? So this reduction in functional tissue leads to a steep decline in thymulin levels, contributing directly to uh, immunosenescence, meaning senescence means old, right? So an older immune system. So by turning on these biological functions, you're turning back the time on your immune system. You're basically making your immune system a younger immune system, right? Which is one of the reasons that Khavinson studied this in anti-aging models so heavily. So in the research findings, he found that it enhanced immunity, it reduced tumors, it increased infection resistance, and restored function to the thymic structure, even after involution had occurred. So after that shrinkage had occurred, he found that it actually grew the thymus gland back. The thymus gland itself was actually not only not shrinking any longer, but actually growing back to some degree. So in the long-term experiments, uh, the thymic peptide preparations or thymulin, as he was using, I think he was actually using thymulin, but thymulin is sort of what we use now in research, which is the most transcriptional pieces of the thymulin peptide chain, right? So we're just using the most relevant piece of it, kind of like you could think of TB500 is actually a fragment of thymosin beta 4. It's not the whole thymosin beta 4 chain, it's just a fragment of it that is the most effective and doesn't have the, let's say, side effects or downsides that the whole piece of thymosin beta 4 has, right? So it was reducing neoplasm in incidence by twofold and significantly improving physiological resistance in aging models. So you can see the immune response efficacy here in this chart. So the green is the peptide treated and the control group is the grayed out. So you can see the T cell count, it's double. The antibody response, almost double. The phagocytosis, about a third more. The tumor resistance, more than double. So this is big. Like this is big news. Like you wonder why these things aren't, out in the open a little bit more. And we'll discuss that in a little bit. There hasn't been a lot of human trials with this stuff past Covenson's research, other than a lot of people using research peptides on their own. There's plenty of real world evidence of this and people using them, but there hasn't been a lot of like clinical data and trials behind these things. These two more than a lot of other peptides, surprisingly. So the molecular structure. So we're now going to talk about Epitalon. So we're going to talk about Epitalon, and then we're going to see how these two things sort of function together. So the molecular structure of Epitalon, which is the pineal gland peptide, is alanine, glutamic acid, aspartic acid, and glycine. So it's a natural pineal peptide complex that comes from epithalamin. And this was identified by Khavinson as the active component responsible for telomerase activation, which is one of the key factors in extending cell replication limit. So as cells replicate, they have a limit of how many times they can replicate, how many times they can be copied, right? And so what happens is when you have that slow down and the cells can't be copied as much, that's aging. So you have more senescent cells present and less newer cells present. And elongating the telomeres extends the cell replication limit. So other biological functions are melatonin modulation, normalizing the endogenous melatonin synthesis, which in turn is helping circadian rhythm, regulating sleep-wake cycles and the biological clock. and antioxidant defense. It's actually reducing oxidative stress and free radical damage. So there's two sides to this: the telomere activation and regulation, and telomerase maintenance. So keeping the telomeres lengthened so they're not shortening anymore, and actually lengthening them with extreme therapy, and the circadian rhythm balance. So Epitalon mechanisms of action. So administration. So Epitalon peptide enters circulation and reaches the target tissues. It induces telomerase activity, promoting telomere elongation, which modulates DNA transcription and histone interactions, which the histone interactions are also going to be helping regulate, again, what proteins are being made in cells, right? Which ones are being turned on and which ones are being turned off, downregulated. It's normalizing melatonin and melatonin synthesis and pineal function, and it's reducing the systemic oxidative stress and inflammation, and extending cellular lifespan and functional health. And again, that cellular lifespan has to do a lot with what we just talked about in the last slide of the extending the cell replication limit. So research is indicating that Epitalon can activate telomerase in human fibroblast cultures, leading to the elongation of telomeres, which is a critical marker of cellular youth. And you can kind of see on the ends of your DNA chains what this actually looks like. So our DNA is like a ladder that twists, right? And so that's what you're seeing here. And those telomeres span across the DNA, and then they hang off the sides, right? And so you can actually see what shortened and controlled aging looks like, and then what elongated and protected looks like. So these are sort of hanging off the DNA a little bit more, and they actually extend past the ends of the DNA rather than being contained within the chains. Kind of interesting.
Yeah.
So how do these two glands, the pineal gland and the thymus, prolong human life? So in his studies, he studied a population between 60 and 85 years old with age-related pathologies. So the peptide therapy using Thymulin and Epitalon preparations. He did long-term studies, 6 to 8 years. Like I said, some of them I believe actually went up to 12 years. And there's a part of one of his studies that I was reading where he cured over 20 people from blindness, age-related blindness, using these two peptides. I think there were some other peptides involved as well, but it was mainly these for a long period of time. So he measured the overall survival, morbidity, and other immune markers. So what they saw measured was mortality rates, disease incidence, and immune function. And what we'll see here is pretty incredible. So when you look at the control group, there was improved immune function, reduced disease incidence, lowered mortality rates, and improved overall health. So the human mortality rate over 6 to 8 years with the control group doubled. Or actually, we should say goes in half, because mortality means death.
Yeah, it goes down.
So it actually went in half. So the mortality rate went from 45% to 22%, let's say, right? The animal lifespan extension went up with Epitalon from the control group by a third, which is pretty incredible.
It is.
So up to 41% with the pineal peptide administration, alongside a twofold reduction in spontaneous tumor formation. So the proposed mechanism of longevity and how these actually work. So peptides enter the nucleus. They penetrate the cell membrane and the nuclear envelope to reach the genetic material. They bind to site-specific DNA regulatory regions or promoters. So they're binding to complementary sequences in the DNA regulatory regions and promoting the gene regulation or reactivation of silenced genes, which are silenced as we get older, right? The those with the that's going back to that immunosuppressants that we or immunosenescence that we were talking about, right? Like as we de-age, the immunosenescence comes back and our immune system becomes more of like it was when we were younger before it senesced.
More useful and vibrant.
And with the promotion of protective protein synthesis essential for tissue function. So the physiological outcome of this was homeostasis, repair, and defense. The restoration of homeostasis and activation of cellular repair mechanisms leading to increased functional lifespans. So the potential clinical applications of these two things. Obviously, we've talked about immunosenescence, immune aging, chronic infections, cancer support, adjuvant therapy to improve immune surveillance and reduce treatment toxicity in cancer support, enhancing resistance to viral and bacterial pathogens, so a better resistance to chronic infections, and restoring thymic output and T cell activity in elderly populations. So T cell activity dramatically decreases as we age as well, right? So longevity and geroprotection, telomerase maintenance, that we've been kind of beating the telomerase over the head. So activating the telomerase to delay cellular senescence and extend replicative lifespan. So we talked again about how telomeres and telomerase causes your replication of cells to be able to be replicated more times so that you have more younger cells constantly and you're getting rid of those senesced cells. So you're constantly building back quicker, fresh new cells. Oxidative stress reduction, boosting antioxidant defense and protecting macromolecules from free radical damage and metabolic regulation. So insulin sensitivity, lipid profiles associated with healthy aging. So this comes into starting to overlap with other peptides that we've been talking about more and more the past 3 or 4 weeks, like retatrutide with the insulin sensitivity and MOTS-c with also insulin sensitivity and also improving mitochondrial function. And then the neuroendocrine balance. So helping regulate the circadian rhythm, the sleep regulation, normalizing melatonin production, and overall hypothalamic pituitary, so the HP axis, right? We call the HPG axis or just the HP axis for overall endocrine health. And that actually starts to really get into when we're talking about hormone regulation and other peptides too, like growth hormone releasing peptides and growth hormone releasing hormones such as CJC1295. Those are all neurocrine HP axis, hypothalamic pituitary axis, sorry, not axis, axis peptides. So there are some limitations and there are some controversies as well. So I want to touch on this a little bit because this isn't all just, rainbows and unicorns. So the vast majority of this research has been done in Russia and in Eastern Europe. So it creates a language access barrier for Western adoption. So people are really starting to find more of Khavinson's work and with AI and translation and things like that are more prevalent these days, it is coming to light more because there have been decades and decades of research, over 40 years of cumulative data, including longitudinal studies on thousands of patients supporting safety and efficacy. So that's the strength versus the challenge. There's limited random controlled trials, RCTs. There's limited, they're scarce in America in Western medical journals. They're kind of large in Eastern Europe and in Russia, where much of this study took place. I would like to see how much peptides are being used in Russia and how the legalities are there and all of that stuff, seeing that most of this research came out of there. We should look that up. That's something that I have
I
never
was
thought about before in all of this until just now.
I was writing that down.
Because we all know that, Europe in general is a little bit behind on these things. That, peptides are just now kind of starting to hit Europe and they're being super regulated and um, they're not quite as open for research as they are here, at least not yet. I think that's going to change soon. But so, mechanism clarity. While telomerase activation is observed, the precise molecular signaling pathways remain under active investigation. So, we can say that yes, we know that telomerase activation creates anti-aging. It does this, that, and the other thing, but they're not exactly sure what pathways that those happen under. We still don't know 100%. Like we can't say we know for a fact it works like this or works like that. Again, I think just because of the lack of study in the West on this, and then also regulatory status. So classification varies globally. Is it a supplement or is it a drug? These things are considered drugs some places. They're considered supplements other places. They're sort of considered in between, kind of like here, they're sort of considered in between. And so that affects the quality of the control and standardization of available products. So that just goes back to like, hey, where are you getting your peptides? Are you getting these things from China, from some janky research company that brought them over here and put them in a vial to sell them to you full of endotoxins? Or are you getting them from a proper source with good COAs and some sort of standardized process in place?
CGMP.
CGMP, NSF certified. NSF goes beyond CGMP as well. And I'm really always proud to say that our facility is NSF certified because it goes a long way beyond even CGMP. So it's sort of like the gold standard. So there's increasing attention from this globally on longevity in the community for functional medicine practitioners and geoprotective intervention. Um, there's growing interest in this coming out of the biohacking community heavily, the aging community, such as, people my age, 50, 60, 70 years old. You know, our generation is now really getting more and more interested in these side of things, in longevity, in sort of staying young until you die, if you will. It's not really about how long you live, it's about how well you live until you die, right? So I always tell people, like, I don't care if I go when I'm 70 or if I go when I'm 100. I want to actually live until I go. So I want to be vital, I want to be strong, I want to have my faculties about me so that whatever my time is here, I can actually enjoy that time, with a safe, sound body and mind.
I like to say more life in
More
your life.
life. Exactly. More life in your life. And then the safety profile. So there's remarkably few adverse effects reported in any clinical literature suggesting the biocompatibility of endogenous peptide mimetics. And actually, I spelled that wrong. It should say mimetics, not mimics. So peptide mimetic. So we always talk about peptides as being things that mimic things in your body, right? So we talk about MOTS-c as being it's like a workout mimetic. It sort of mimics what working out does to your body, to your mitochondria. It sort of mimics what a fast, what a like a 3-day water fast or 4-day water fast would do in your body. MOTS-c. So if you can't afford MOTS-c, just do a 3 or 4 day water fast. You're going to get the same mitochondrial biogenesis, biogenical um, effects as you would from taking MOTS-c. It's literally what it does. So there's always two ways to skin a cat, right?
Yeah.
And then on an epigenetic basis, it aligns with our modern understanding of aging as epigenetic phenomenon, offering a targeted intervention strategy. So while these things have some challenges and some limitations from the past, I think the strengths outweigh the limitations, and the limitations are starting to be put aside and studied a little bit more. And I think we're going to find these two peptides in the next couple of years coming to the forefront of the longevity space. I really do. I've been hearing a lot more people stirring and chattering about Khavinson's research in recent weeks. So future directions. What are we studying these things for? So epigenetic regulation, so elucidating the precipice, that mechanisms by which peptides modulate chromatin structure and histone modifications. So really talking about tuning your epigenetic structure, right? Rejuvenating the immune system, developing peptide sequences that target specific genes involved in hereditary conditions and metabolic aging. So we're kind of talking about all peptides here, not necessarily just Thymulin and Epitalon, but as longevity medicine, the integration of these bioregulators as protective medical practice for lifespan extension it's the future direction. I really truly believe that they represent a new class of anti-aging therapeutics. So, key takeaways: Thymulin, a zinc-dependent thymic peptide that acts as the primary immune system regulator. It supports T cell maturation and differentiation and is crucial for maintaining immune competence during aging. So, we talked about that immunosenescence, getting rid of that, having a strong balanced immune system that's not overactive, but is super strong and does exactly what it's supposed to in balance, homeostasis. Epitalon is a synthetic tetrapeptide derived from the pineal gland that has been shown to activate telomerase, regulate circadian biology via melatonin modulation, and increase lifespan in animal models. And Khavinson's research has been decades long and showing how these things can interact with our DNA and restore youthful gene expression to potentially slow the aging process and reducing mortality rate. And quite a bit of clinical evidence, again, with the language barrier and this coming from Eastern Europe and primarily Russia as well. And we all know, in the 80s and even into the 90s, the whole Cold War with Russia, and Americans didn't know much about anything Russian, science or otherwise. They kept things kind of to themselves for a long time, and we did as well. We didn't share a lot of things, but that's starting to change in recent years, and for the good of all of us. So if you guys want to study further Khavinson's research, I'm glad to email you guys one of the main papers, the neuroendocrinology papers, which I took much of this information from. But here's a couple of references here for some of his main papers that were referenced here in this material that we went over today.
Fantastic. Fantastic. Well, and you talk about some of the stuff that was kind of behind the proverbial iron curtain. I don't know if I know that you do breathing exercises and things as well. If you're familiar with the Bottega method, right?
I'm not.
He was a Russian scientist as well who correlated breathing rates with disease.
Oh, wow.
And his breathing methods are all about really reducing your breathing. And he was studying people, and he noticed that in modern life, people are breathing almost twice as often as they were 100 years ago.
Interesting.
Yeah. So 14 breaths a minute is actually a hyperventilation state, but many people are breathing somewhere in that range. His research for a long time was not.
That probably explains why people have such hyperactive and overactive nervous systems, and everybody's, autonomic nervous system isn't on, but everybody's nervous system's tuned up to hell all day, every day.
Absolutely.
You know,
So
I always used to, in medicine work, in psychedelic medicine work, when you are sitting with medicines, we always used to say the breath controls everything.
does.
If everything is feeling too fast and intense, slow the breath and it slows the experience. Everything slows down.
So
If you want to speed it up, breathe fast, breathe
fire
faster.
breathe.
You know, it tunes up the nervous system and everything becomes like more intense, greater, faster, more visual, more everything, right? So,
Well,
yeah.
it's your regulatory. You can upregulate and downregulate your nervous system by your breathing. But Bottega was really the first one to scientifically go through that. Now there are
Was he the one that developed the doing the breath ladder? Like
breath
where you
lab,
breathe in, like you breathe in for one, two, then you hold it for two, then you breathe out for two.
breath
And you do
holds.
that a couple of times, and then
Yeah.
you breathe in for three or four and hold it for four, and then breathe out for four. And then you just keep going up this ladder.
That is a variation, but yes, yeah. The a lot of his work is definitely based on breath holds. And also stressing your pulmonary system by doing these breath holds and also controlling carbon dioxide. Because the reason why we breathe is the chemoreceptors. And your chemoreceptors say, hey, there's too much carbon dioxide, you need to breathe. We're really trying to get out the carbon dioxide. And if your chemoreceptors are too sensitive to carbon dioxide, you will breathe more rapidly. So part of his exercises by the breath hold is also to condition your body and those chemo to reset those chemoreceptors so that they are not telling you to breathe prematurely. So you start to feel panicked, like I have to breathe. So
Right.
many people that start as practice, that's one of the big things that they have to overcome is the breathe, and the breath hold isn't I breathe in and hold, I hold.
Hmm.
So now we're having your body has to get used to that. Now some people will have a problem with that. I've had some traumatic things, so um, it's actually helped me a lot. I I really, for the most part, breathe through my nose 100%. Um, even when I get a cold, I'll really get a plugged nose. Um,
Don't be a mouth breather, man.
it's mouth. It used to be at the turn of the century, you called somebody a mouth breather. You know what I meant?
Yeah, it meant you were like a fish.
You were adult. You were
Yeah.
you were you were a
You're
dimwit.
retarded,
Yeah,
dimwit.
you.
Yeah.
How many people do you see
There's
now?
actually a lot of studies that say if you breathe out of your mouth, it actually changes the structure of your musculature and your bone structure in your face, and it can actually make you look uglier.
It actually will recess your.
There's like a literally a whole school of thought around this.
There's a whole line of dentistry that is based on that because what happens is the jaw actually recesses. So you see the people with like the frog look and their chins are kind of pushed back and they have like
Yeah,
the
they don't have a good
right,
bone.
and then they don't even, and everything just kind of comes right down into their neck. That was because they were probably a mouth breather. So it's an undeveloped jaw. They will end up having more orthodontia because of that fact. Their jaws do not develop, and the recession of the jaw is actually your body trying to compensate for you breathing from your mouth. So it's
Hmm.
trying to open the airway so you can get more air in.
Yeah, it makes
Um,
sense.
but your nose does like 30 different things. It's actually even more than that. But it does, according to the American Lung Association, there's five major things. It cleans the air, it warms the air, it moistens the air before it hits your lungs.
Wow.
When you breathe through your mouth, everything that you bring in goes right into your lungs. Any contaminants go right into your lungs. Cold air makes your bronchial tubes constrict, so you're less efficient. So when you breathe through your nose, you're more efficient, period.
Makes
So,
100% sense.
and when I'm working with kids, I tell them that's a joke and you can use it. Breathing through your mouth or breathing through your mouth is like eating through your nose.
I like that.
So, but another Russian scientist who kind of in the Western world was in obscurity until a couple of authors really took his work and brought it to the Western world.
Till breathwork became an American phenomenon in the last, let's say,
Absolutely.
5 to 8 years.
Absolutely. Well, then you have like Wim Hof, who uses kind of a variation really of it. Um, you have McEwen, who does the oxygen advantage, and then you have Nestor, who him and McEwen are very much pretty much the same. They're both Bottega practitioners, and they've kind of put their little bit of their Western spin on it.
Hmm.
So
Cool.
that's got a little bit on a tangent on that. I'm
I
passionate
like
about
it.
it. I just think it's a tool that we all have with us, no matter where you are. I love to meditate, but sometimes when somebody's right in front of you and they are stomping all over your last nerve, it's hard to close your eyes and meditate in front of them. That actually might make it worse. But you can
You
always
can
change.
always breathe.
You can
Yeah,
always breathe. You can always change your breathing pattern. They don't know what you're doing, and you just seem like a rock. Nothing phases you. You got this tool in your pocket that you pull out whenever you want.
I
So,
love it.
yeah, yeah. So
So, speaking of tangent, is there any
sorry about
questions
that.
about
Yeah,
anything today or anything? I don't see any questions in the webinar chat.
none. I don't have any questions in the chat or in the Q&A. Please don't be shy.
Cool. Maybe it was just a nice little presentation today and we don't got any questions.
I think it was great. Now, the one thing I do want to ask you, because we always try to tie this into nutrition as well, and the Thymulin you were saying would require that you up your zinc game basically while you're on your cycle of Thymulin. What would be some good, just natural nutritional things, natural foods that you could be eating that are high in that zinc? And if anybody also in the audience has some suggestions, please either raise your hand but you should be able to unmute yourself and talk. Um, but those,
So things that are high in zinc, extremely high zinc sources in food would be like oysters,
hmm
grass-fed beef, lamb, crab, dark turkey meat. Oysters are the highest zinc food on earth. Oysters have like a massive zinc.
it's crazy.
So other foods with really, really high zinc content are pumpkin seeds, hemp seeds, cashews, chickpeas, lentils, um, eggs, Greek yogurt, dark chocolate. I knew dark chocolate had it.
hmm
Sorry, I have a little chat GPT window up here. I just when you asked that question, I was like, oh, let's find out.
I knew
Um,
about the oysters, but some of those I
so
didn't think
so
about.
daily intake targets for by group, let's just say men and women, daily intake targets of zinc should sit somewhere around 11 milligrams per day for men and 8
hmm
milligrams a day for women. For optimal immune support, that should be much higher. It should be more like 15 to 30 milligrams of zinc per day.
Wow.
So many clinicians are recommending 20 to 30 milligrams of zinc per day when supporting thymic peptides. So something to really think about. And zinc absorption tips. So when you eat zinc with protein, it absorbs better. So avoid large amounts of phytates or grains and beans in the same meal. So like you can have some beans in one meal, but try not to have like this kind of bean, like 7 bean chili. You ain't eating that to get zinc absorption, right?
Lots of fiber, right? But
So also avoid taking high calcium or high iron supplements with zinc. Those need to be taken away from each other. So zinc needs a certain amount of time to absorb, and low zinc can cause a weakened immune system. We all know that.
Mhm.
You up your zinc when you get a cold, when you get the flu, you always take extra zinc. So it can create slower wound healing, low testosterone, poor
Mhm.
taste and smell sensations, hair loss, and poor thymus function. Of course, poor thymus function, like we just talked about.
Yeah.
So, simple zinc boost meal ideas are for breakfast, you could have pumpkin seeds or eggs. So if you're having a protein shake, Pumpkin seeds in your protein shake would be a great way to get a natural zinc boost without taking a zinc supplement.
Mhm.
Um, for lunch, it says a grass-fed steak salad. I don't know what the vegans are going to do for lunch, so I guess you're gonna intermittently fast. So for dinner, lamb or beef and certain vegetables, and then a snack, dark chocolate and cashews can boost zinc highly.
Okay.
So
Love
many
cashew.
practitioners will be pairing Thymulin with 15 to 30 milligrams of zinc,
Okay.
vitamin D, and selenium. Those can all help boost thymus function and immune signaling.
Brazilian nuts are a great source of selenium.
Yep, I eat like 2 or 3 Brazil nuts every day. I love them.
And that's all you need too. That's what's the crazy thing. Just a couple of those will take care of what you need.
Yep.
And so
Cool. All right. Well, looks like we finished on time tonight. No questions.
no questions. Well, we didn't have any questions, so they didn't spur us on to go longer. So well,
Cool.
thank you.
Well, yeah. Thanks for joining us, everybody, for the Epitalon and Thymulin presentation. Hope you all enjoyed it and send it to your friends who didn't show up.
Please do.
They want to check it out.
And thank you once again for joining us on the Peptide Forum. We'll see you next week. Just want to let you know that the following week, next week, we're going to be doing melanotan too. Um,
Next week, no, next week we're off. It's going to be the next week. Next week we're taking off.
yeah, the 24th.
24th. Yeah.
We will not be in. Next week, I
No,
was just saying,
the 17th we won't be in.
oh, the 17th. All right. So,
Yeah, we're Alba and I are going to be traveling that week.
okay. So, do we want to do it on the 24th or do you want to be, are we going to be off 17th and the 24th?
No, I think we're back on for the 24th. We're just moving
Okay.
the 17th to the 24th.
Okay. So, we will skip next week. The 24th, we will be reconvening with, uh,
Tony,
yes,
can
ma'am.
we, can we use the link that you created for the 17th for the 24th?
Absolutely. So, if
Okay,
you got
And
that
we'll
link,
change the date on it.
I'll
okay, great.
change the date. You're going to get another email from Zoom that'll say, hey, they've changed something. Because we'll change the date. So I'll make sure that that happens right after we get done. This one also has an on-demand link, so you should get that automatically. If you share that on-demand link, anybody that you share it with will be able to get in. They just have to put in their email address and sign in, and they should get access to the webinar. If for any reason that doesn't work correctly, please email us, and I will make sure that you get a link that does work. But that's the way it's supposed to work according to Zoom. So we're testing that method out, so then that way everybody can control their access. Well, also, I believe Alba's also posting that on a YouTube channel, right? If that's not correct.
That's correct. Yeah. So
Yeah.
basically, the video it will be sent automatically, or sorry, how
It'll
does it
they'll
work?
send them they'll send a link that will give them on-demand access.
You will send it to me,
I'm
or
going to send you a link that so you can go ahead and post it and download it. Just the same link that I sent you last
perfect.
time for the other one. I thought the on-demand was going to allow you to download it, but it doesn't. So that was a hole in my vision on that. So
Okay. Okay. Great.
yeah.
Awesome.
Yeah, so that's why I was back and forth with you. I wanted to make sure the way that I did it the second time it actually worked.
Yes. Okay. Great. Awesome. Thank you so much.
No problem. A pleasure, everybody. Have a wonderful evening, and we will see you in 2 weeks.
Peace.
Peace out. Have a wonderful day. Ciao.
Bye.
Bye-bye.